Hello, I'm the Resolute Cartographer, and this is the story of what happened to Lexington. We'll start with an examination of the sites surrounding Lexington in the Fallout universe and in the real world. We'll then move into the layout of the town in the Fallout universe and how it compares to the layout of the town in the real world. We'll examine the history of Lexington in the Fallout universe and a brief history of Lexington in the real world. I'll close with my thoughts on the content found in Lexington. Let's get started. In the Fallout universe, Lexington is located in the northwestern part of the central region of the Commonwealth that we get to explore in Fallout 4. Northwest of Lexington, lying between it and neighboring Concord, lies a drumlin diner that serves as the home to its proprietor Trudy and her jet-addicted son Patrick. Northwest of Lexington lies the Starlight Drive-In, a drive-in movie theater. Northeast of Lexington, one can find the Rotten Landfill, a heap of garbage that is home to many mole rats. Southeast of Lexington lies Mass Gravel and Sand, a building materials depot. Southwest of Lexington lies Jalbert Brothers Disposal, a small junkyard that was, until recently, home to a group of the Children of Adam Faithful. As for local municipalities, real-world Lexington lies approximately 6.5 miles east-southeast of Concord, while in-game Lexington is directly southeast of Concord. While in-game Lexington practically borders Cambridge, in the real world Cambridge lies approximately 8 miles southeast of Lexington with multiple municipalities lying in between. As mentioned in my video on Concord, while I couldn't find a real-world analog for Fort Hagen, which lies west-southwest of Lexington in-game, I also couldn't find an in-game analog for the real-world Hanscom Air Force Base, which borders Lexington to the northwest. While real-world Lexington lies on a small stream known as Vine Brook, in-game Lexington lies just west of a larger body of water that I believe corresponds to the Mystic Lakes. While the real Mystic Lakes lie about 4 miles east of Lexington, the shape in-game is similar to the shape of the real lakes, and I believe that the name of the local retirement home, Mystic Pines, is a nod to this as well. In the Fallout universe, as in the real world, Lexington is laid out on a generally northwest to southeast axis, but other than this there are few similarities. The town is much more of an urban setting in the Fallout universe, with highways passing right over the town. In contrast to this, real-world Lexington scarcely tops 2 stories in height and lies within a well-forested area, bound to the west and north by I-95. The Lexington Common is flipped 180 degrees compared to the real-world location, with the in-game Minutemen statue facing northwest, while the real-world Minutemen statue faces southeast. Real-world Lexington is fairly well spread out and is home not only to the historic downtown, but also woods, streams, and in the outer reaches, some light industrial sections that are home to pharmaceutical companies and laboratories. While there is a rail line running through the area in the Fallout universe, the real-world rail line that once ran straight through Lexington was out of use by the 1980s, and the rails were removed back in 1992, at least as far as I can tell. The former route that this rail line took now serves as the course of the Minuteman Bikeway, a feature that is definitely absent from the in-game version of Lexington. Alright, on to the composition of the town in-game. In the Fallout universe, Lexington is home to 15 houses, apartments, a retirement home, shops, office buildings, a deli mart, a super duper mart with attached parking garage, a construction equipment company, a Corvega assembly plant, a diner, a Slocum's Joe, a hardware store, a liquor store, a pharmacy, a laundromat, a Red Rocket quick coolant recharge station, a Red Rocket gas station, a bank, a theater, a playground, a basketball court, a bus station, 5 bus stops, and a Pulowski preservation shelter. Along with the obvious structures, buried below Lexington's west end lies a secret Defense Intelligence Agency base. With the setting established, let's look at the history of Lexington in the Fallout universe. Before the war, Lexington appears to have been a bustling community with a mixed economy. Locals were employed in the office buildings, the service sector, and manufacturing jobs within the Corvega assembly plant. The Corvega plant was of such importance to the community that Lexington built a large sign conferring the town with the nickname of Corvega Town. In opposition to the natural beauty of real-world Lexington, Lexington in the Fallout universe appears to have fully embraced car culture to the point that much of the town is covered by elevated highways. Strangely, many of the supports for the extensive elevated roads in the area appear to have been integrated into apartment buildings or potentially were even just disguised as apartment buildings, as many of these small apartments don't seem to have any means of entry. Along with those who worked in the Corvega plant, the offices, and the service sector, there were those that pretended to work service sector jobs at Slocum's Joe. In truth, these workers would descend the stairs into the basement kitchen of the donut shop and use a hidden elevator to access the deeply buried aforementioned DIA base. Once within, these intelligence officers monitored threats to the homeland. They couldn't tell people what they really did, so their relatives believed that they worked in the shipping department at the Slocum's Joe. Part of their work included building, maintaining, and operating the predictive analytic machine, a computer system that they sought to use to forecast the future. Pam predicted, among other things, that the Chinese stealth technology was so much more advanced than America's that there was a 91% chance that the Chinese had large-scale stealth projects underway, including the possibility of a fleet of stealth subs. After 10 years of working with her, the staff wanted to give Pam a body, and thus on January 28, 2077, she was installed on an Assaultron chassis, making her mobile. The ongoing threat from the war wasn't just felt in the DIA base, though, and north of Lexington, travelers faced one of the Boston area military checkpoints that searched for potential foreign agents. At the local Super Duper Mart, an unpleasant employee by the name of Sally had recently been fired and replaced by a large and unpleasantly loud espresso machine. While this sudden state of joblessness might have seemed like the end of the world to Sally, this feeling would soon be given perspective. Saturday, October 23, 2077 dawned crisp and clear. At the Starlight Drive-In, several cars remained from the night before, with those who had had a bit too much to drink finding another way home. Local shops were decorated for Halloween, including the Super Duper Mart, where shoppers were picking up food for the weekend, and diners sat in the in-store cafe. On the other side of town, the first shift was underway at the Corvega plant. North and west of town, freight trains traveled along the local line, carrying among other things, granite from thicket excavations and military equipment. The local highways were full of cars traveling to, from, and around Boston. The calm of the morning was broken suddenly by the scream of civil defense sirens. While some Lexingtonians likely viewed this as nothing more than yet another drill, the news on the radio and television was clear. Bombs were detonating across the country. The war with China had come home. Chaos ensued. A soldier, cradling a mini nuke, locked himself in the local Pulowski Preservation Shelter, leaving a handful of desperate civilians to pound on the door. In rapid succession, two new suns appeared on the horizon, one to the southeast in Cambridge, and another far to the southwest. In a matter of seconds, waves of force and fire lashed the city, shattering windows and battering those in their path. The electromagnetic pulse from the bombs burned out most electronics, including those in vehicles. A vertibird fell out of the sky and crashed into the Mystic Lakes. Cars, trucks, and buses on ground streets and elevated roads stopped working. The ground shifted suddenly and shook violently as the force of the bombs let loose long locked fault lines. In this shaking, trains derailed and sections of the elevated highway fell to earth, crushing whatever lay below. While some of the vehicles on the elevated highways had stopped safely, many others crashed or fell as sections of concrete gave way beneath them. Others still were ejected from the highway, including one driver who, still drinking from the night before, ended up lodged in an apartment a few floors above the ground below. As the shaking subsided, those who hadn't been killed watched as the mushroom clouds began to dissipate into dark clouds that filled the sky. Some tried to find whatever shelter they could. Others settled in with friends and family, deciding to go out together in comfort. At Mystic Pines, residents of the retirement home had been watching TV, working in the greenhouse, and resting in their rooms. While some of the elderly occupants were picked up by their families, a few weren't so lucky. One wheelchair-bound man grabbed a case of beer and locked himself in the greenhouse supply closet. A wicked shipping truck that was transporting illegal materials for crime boss Eddie Winter was stalled by the EMP. Unable to exit the trailer and facing an agonizing death from radiation poisoning or starvation, the guard inside committed suicide. Above the liquor store, a couple office workers decided they would down a bottle of vodka each as they watched the world end. At the Starlight Drive-In, the projectionist lay down on a mattress, gun in hand, prepared to hold off potential looters. Attempting to take advantage of the chaos, an opportunistic couple turned to bank robbing, blasting a hole in the rear wall of the local bank vault. The cash they stuffed into duffel bags had been made no more valuable than the paper it was printed on, and their foolish larceny ended in death as highly radioactive black rain fell around them. Within hours, Lexington lay quiet under a layer of radioactive fallout that had once been the plants, structures, and people of Cambridge. Out of the ashes rose the new inhabitants of Lexington, hundreds of feral ghouls that would rule the city over the next 210 years. While the ghouls would control the city, they wouldn't be the only residents over that time. In 2281, the old DIA base under the Slocum's Joe was found by Tommy Whispers, a member of the synthetic human manumitting group known as the Railroad. The base would become known to the railroad as the Switchboard, and it would serve as their headquarters until 2287, when it was discovered by the railroad's mortal enemy, the Synthetic Human Producing Institute. The base was swarmed by the Institute, with many members of the railroad falling in the attack. Around this time, Lexington also received a new group of settlers in the form of Jared's Raider Gang. Jared's Raiders seized the old Corvega plant, clearing the ghouls from the structure, and installed turrets and traps to prevent further ghouls from entering the facility through the sewer tunnels. Kidnapped as a child, Jared had been raised by raiders until he became one himself. Before his kidnapping, he had lived in a group with a woman by the name of Mama Murphy. As improbable as it might seem, this woman could see the future when she imbibed significant quantities of drugs. Jared sought this power for himself, and thus he took whatever he could get his hands on. This effort was to no avail. It became clear that it wasn't the drugs, it was some innate gift possessed by Mama Murphy that was activated by drugs. Jared decided to search for those who might have this gift. Thus he sent his men out to secure the town, creating a net that could be used to catch potential passers-by. One of Jared's people, Freddie, spotted a group coming into town in late October 2287. He reported this to Jared's lieutenant, Gristle. Gristle noted that among the group was an old woman, not unlike the one that Jared had told them to be on the lookout for. Along with this, one of these people had on a cowboy hat, a hat that Gristle sorely desired. He asked Jared for more men and chased after the caravan. This group was in fact a series of refugees, remnants of the citizens of the recently destroyed settlement in Old Quincy. Protected by the remains of the Minutemen militia group, they had not just come this way to get away from Quincy, but because Mama Murphy had had a vision that they would find sanctuary in the northwest near Concord. The refugees entered Lexington unaware of the severity of the ghoul infestation and were forced to fight a running battle as they moved through town. They got separated near the Super Duper Mart, and two of the members of the Minutemen, Emma and Josh, hid within the supermarket's loading dock. Josh decided to head into the store to search the pharmacy for medical supplies. He was quickly overwhelmed by the ghouls within. Emma, too, was soon taken down by the ghouls as well, but the rest of the group managed to get out of Lexington and continue on to Concord. Gristle would catch up to them there, but that story is contained within the What Happened to Concord lore video. Back to Lexington. Even having sent Gristle and a sizable number of raiders after the Quincy refugees, Jared's raiders still have the manpower to occupy a good chunk of the town. From an elevated walkway, they fired down onto the Lexington Common. They maintain a heavily trapped apartment block, and elsewhere they've installed turrets to control a home and the adjacent street. In the remains of an old penthouse apartment, they have taken to committing strange and disturbing acts. Before he sent Gristle to Concord, Jared had sent his people all over the area, harassing farmsteads and generally making life difficult for the locals. Should the Minutemen reform under the leadership of the sole survivor of Vault 111, Jared faces justice for these assaults. Along with this, should the sole survivor decide to assist the railroad, they'll find themselves entering the old DIA base via the secret backdoor drainage pipe entrance. That's about all I could find on the endgame history of Lexington, so let's move on to the real-world history of Lexington. Lexington and Concord are only about 6.5 miles apart, so while they have different histories from the time of human settlement on, their geological history is quite similar. Along with this, Lexington appears to be within the historic territory of the Massachusetts nation, just as Concord is. Although it appears to me that Lexington lies outside of the territory that was once controlled by the Nipmuc, unlike Concord. If you're interested in the pre-colonial history of the area, feel free to check out my lore video on Concord. The real differentiation in the histories of Lexington and Concord starts with the colonial history of the early 17th century. The following is a summary of what I found in the thorough work of the Lexington Historical Commission. The area in which Lexington lies was settled in the 1640s as the outer part of Cambridge, which was itself founded in 1630. Originally named Cambridge Farms, the people of Cambridge used this land for hayfields and woodlots. Transportation through the area was typically along native trails that were improved over time by the settlers. By 1682, approximately 180 people were living in the area. Tired of traveling 5 to 10 miles to church on Sunday, the people of Cambridge Farms organized and petitioned for their own church. This request, though opposed by those in Cambridge proper, was granted December 15, 1691. A simple meeting house was established in 1692, and the town received their first resident priest, the Reverend Benjamin Esterbrook, in 1693. The Cambridge Farms Meeting House would serve as the new center for the area, shifting future development from the north to south Watertown to Bedford route to the east to west Cambridge to Concord corridor. The area began to develop more swiftly in the early 18th century as new industries arrived. Lumber in the area was used in shipbuilding, clay pits were dug for pottery, and peat was harvested from local bogs for use as fuel. A public common was established in 1711 that would go on to hold a larger meeting house and pound. 1713 was marked by the rebranding of Cambridge Farms as Lexington. Aesthetics became more important during this period, and the structures in town took on Georgian architecture. By 1765, Lexington's population had risen to 912. The most important event in the history of Lexington took place April 19, 1775, with the battles of Lexington and Concord. Concerned by the quantities of arms held by local militias, the British in Boston decided to seize those weapons before they could be used against them. John Hancock and Samuel Adams had been in Lexington the night before, and fearing their capture, Dr. Joseph Warren sent William Dawes and Paul Revere to warn them about the impending raid. After they'd warned these two sons of liberty, the riders moved on to continue spreading the word. As Hancock and Adams prepared to leave that dawn, 77 militia members under Captain John Parker mustered on the Lexington Common to challenge the British. While they were driven off by the Redcoats with 8 dead, the Brits would soon find themselves outmatched and conquered. The King's men would be forced to fight a running battle on their retreat to Boston. Lexington lost 10 men that day, more, proportional to their population, than either Cambridge or Concord, who also committed forces to the effort. A monument erected on the site on July 4, 1799, is the oldest Revolutionary War memorial in the nation, and serves as the gravesite to those slain in the Battle of Lexington. In the remainder of the 18th century, Lexington, though primarily an agricultural town, was also a center of local commerce. Lying on the road between Boston and New Hampshire, it had the cargo for both destinations pass through, and was considered the last stop before Boston in this time. The town's population crested 1,000 for the first time in 1800. The early 19th century brought with it 2 new turnpikes passing through and around Lexington. Having been primarily composed of subsistence farmers in the previous century, the 19th century brought large-scale dairy farming to Lexington. Benjamin Wellington founded the first of these farms, and by 1826 there were 30 milk carts that left Lexington for Boston every day. Lexington was also home to a large fur industry in this time from the late 18th to the mid-19th century, turning furs into capes, caps, muffs, boas, gloves, and fur-lined goods. The industry was so prominent in Lexington that it made it the 3rd biggest fur goods producer after Boston and New York City. Lexington saw the arrival of the first railroad in 1846, and soon this line set Lexington midway on the route between Cambridge and Concord. Lexington expanded quickly in the aftermath of the railroad's construction, with many new immigrants to the area arriving from Ireland. These immigrants were primarily farmers, and by the 1860s, these Irish Americans had purchased over 1,000 acres of land in the area. They farmed potatoes, corn, and raised cattle on this land. The first Catholic services were held in Lexington in 1852, but it wasn't until 1873 that these immigrants received their own church. The fascinating thing about this is one can't but think of Boston as a Catholic city, yet the city was founded by Protestants, and that was the dominant faith in the city and the surrounding area for well over a century. Anyway, along with the Irish immigrants moving to the area, the railroad also led Lexington to become a true commuting suburb of Boston, with professionals also moving in during this period. The mid-19th century also brought the rising of the abolitionist and temperance movements in Lexington. The dairy industry was huge at this time, and in 1875 Lexington was second only to Worcester in milk production. More Irish immigrants moved into the area, finding work in the service sector and on farms. Many manors and mansions were constructed in Lexington during this time, though unfortunately many of them have been demolished or burned down. As Lexington continued its march from farming community to suburb, many of the farms closest to downtown were sold off, subdivided, and turned into housing. The first Lexington Minuteman weekly newspaper started publishing in 1871. The Lexington Gas Company began operation in 1875 and established 66 gas lamps in the town center. Telephone service began in 1882 with 31 subscribers by 1884. The town continued to grow through this period, and while in 1871 trains ran to and from Boston 8 times a day during the week and twice on Sundays, by 1900 this rose to 11 a day and 7 on Sunday, stopping at 5 different Lexington stations by 1904. By 1915, the population of Lexington grew to 5,538 and was far more ethnically diverse than it had been a century prior. Schools became better organized through the late 19th and early 20th century, merging 6 schools into 2. 1916 was the year the first in-home sewer connection was made in Lexington. It's kind of crazy to consider there were 34 years between when residents could have a phone installed and when they could have a working toilet installed. Maybe it's not such a bad thing that those old mansions were demolished. Automobiles began to be introduced in 1900, and farmers were soon carrying their goods to Boston by truck. Garages and filling stations began to be constructed, and bus service was introduced in 1924. Roads expanded with the increased traffic, and regional roads were built, including Route 128, a circumferential artery that was meant to encircle Boston. By 1940, the population had grown to 13,113. The American entrance into World War II marked a stark decline in the farming industry in Lexington as manpower was taken up with the war effort. When the war ended, Lexington, like America, boomed. Veterans returned home and built houses and filled them with families. Between 1940 and 1950, Lexington's population grew 32% to 17,335. Hundreds of single-family homes and multifamily dwellings were constructed in Lexington. Some of the 19th century estates that had been built in the railroad boom were broken up and sold off for new housing construction. New schools and churches were built. Large office parks were constructed. By 1960, the population had risen another 60% from 17,335 to 27,691. And by 1970, another 15% increase to 31,886. Over the years, unlike larger cities, Lexington has actually shrunk in height, replacing 3-story structures with 1- and 2-story structures, leading to its state in the modern day. While the population did shrink in the 1970s and 80s, it has risen since the 1990s, leading to the modern-day estimate of just under 34,000. Today, Lexington is a beautiful suburb of Boston with a historic past. Alright, I think that's enough on real-world Lexington, so let me get into my thoughts on Lexington and perhaps provide some clarification on things. First, something on real-world Lexington that I really do wish we'd seen more of in-game. From what I found, in 2010, Lexington had the second highest Asian population in Massachusetts behind Quincy. As of 2010, Quincy had an Asian population of 24%, and of that population, 66% were of Chinese origin. Given the hostility shown by the American government to the Chinese Americans in the Fallout universe, it would have been interesting to see this dynamic play out in Lexington. While we don't have any reason to believe that demographics in any city in the real world in 2010 would be the same as they would be in 2077 in the Fallout universe, I would have liked to see this play out. Second, you may have noticed that while I typically give the number of the type of structure as it exists in a city, such as 12 apartments, I simply said apartments. This is because I was having a hell of a time trying to differentiate between offices and apartments. I usually use furniture to make a determination. The structure has a kitchen and a television, it's probably an apartment. It has a metal office desk, it's probably an office. Most of these structures, though, are either not open, or if they are, they're mostly bare. Because I couldn't get an accurate count, I simply gave the general apartments and office buildings. Third, the parking lot of the Starlight Drive-In, it's weird. There are a lot of cars in the lot. The bombs dropped in the morning. Why would there be so many cars in a drive-in theater lot in the light of day? Why are there waste barrels in the center of the lot? I came to multiple conclusions. The first, and consequently the one that I put in my narrative, was that there was a lot of drinking and the drivers took cabs or buses home rather than drive drunk. Another possibility is that with fuel being unavailable in any practical sense, and fusion cars still not being as common as might be desired, the drive-in used permanently parked cars as seating, and viewers came to the site by foot, bus, or carpool and sat in the provided cars. The third possibility I considered was that the site was inoperative by the time of the bombs, and it was serving as a junkyard. This concept is perhaps congruent with the waste barrels lying in the center of the site. Lastly, maybe the site designer at Bethesda simply didn't consider that the bombs came in the morning, and that the site would likely not be filled with cars, or possibly they considered it, and they wanted there to be junk at the site that could be used by players regardless. Fourth, I found it odd that no record exists of the DIA base being used between 2077 and 2281. Why didn't the workers grab their families as the early warning came through and drag them into work? There likely wasn't a vast stash of supplies there, but they'd have a better chance surviving there than on the surface. I could say maybe there were survivors there and the railroad erased the evidence of this simply by living there, but there's plenty of pre-war entries, so that possibility seems out. Fifth, I couldn't figure out if there was another group that had occupied the elevated highway in front of the Corvega plant, or if the structures there were also built by Jared's Raiders. An interesting thing to consider is that there may have been a society that was constructed there above the ghouls on the ground level, and that they may have been destroyed when the elevated road at the west end collapsed, letting the ghouls onto the highway. There's no evidence for this, but the structures don't really seem like a Raider outpost either. Without evidence as to what this place was, I didn't know how to fit it into the story. Alright, I think that should do it for Lexington. If you want to receive notifications when I launch these lore videos, you can follow me on Twitter at GamingWithMaps. If you appreciate what I do here and want to support the channel financially, you can become a patron on Patreon. I want to thank my patrons Mesothelioma, 76 of Texas, Jill AWS, and Brian for their support. I also want to thank my wife for her involvement with this video. This has been the Irresolute Cartographer. Thanks for watching. I'll see you again next time.